Hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's good to be with you on this Thursday, February 24th. And tonight, the world is talking about Russia and Ukraine. Russian forces are continuing their advance. Today, they captured Chernobyl, but not for that old power plant. The location gives them a clearer path to Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Our teams around the world are watching for new developments in this invasion. We'll also answer your questions about this crisis, including what Vladimir Putin's endgame might be and what other world powers might do to stop him. How much impact will President Biden's new sanctions have? Plus, we'll hear what people in Ukraine are thinking and doing as their nation is under attack. All right, if you are tuning in expecting our Black History Month special, we hope to bring you that tomorrow night. But tonight, we need to focus on Ukraine, nearly 24 hours into Russia's invasion. Russian troops hit Ukraine by air, land, and sea, and soon they had taken control of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It is the site of history's worst nuclear disaster and a reminder of what Soviet rule meant for many people's lives. Lawmakers on the House and Senate Intelligence Committees say Russian troops appear bound for the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. In response, American and European leaders have imposed even harsher sanctions on Russia. President Biden suggested that their impact will be felt over time.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia's attack has killed or wounded at least 400 Ukrainian soldiers. He's added that he is still here in Kyiv and that his family is still in Ukraine. Also, we just learned that the UN Security Council will meet tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern, that's 8 p.m. GMT, and it will vote on a resolution to stop the war in Ukraine. Perhaps no surprise, Russia is expected to veto that resolution. We have a number of reports to start the program tonight, beginning in Kyiv with NBC's Aaron McLaughlin. Aaron, give us the latest on the ground there.
Hey, Joshua. Well, in that address you just mentioned, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also urged Ukrainians to adhere to the curfew now in place. It's set to last until 7 a.m., part of the martial law order now people here are subject to. And I can tell you, it's looking out at the Capitol, the streets are completely empty. People are listening. It is eerily calm here after a chaotic day in which we heard explosion after explosion after explosion and then siren sounds starting at 5 a.m. yesterday morning. The attack lasted through the day into the evening hours. A number of military installations were hit, including airfields. Russian soldiers crossed the Belarusian border, and there was a firefight in their Chernobyl area between Russian soldiers and Ukrainian military. Russian soldiers having seized the Chernobyl nuclear reactor plant. This as people here in Kyiv tried to flee by the thousands. There was a traffic jam leaving the city, going in the westward direction, widely seen to be the safest place to be here in Ukraine. There were long lines at gas stations, long lines at ATMs as people were also hunkering down for their lives inside metro stations and bomb shelters. People here are absolutely terrified. They are urging, though, people to take up arms, to arm themselves. I was outside the National Police Station yesterday as they were handing out AK-47s. I talked to a local member of parliament who was there to pick up 2 weapons, one for himself and one for his wife. They were hiding in the suburbs. He said that he was going to go home and Google to figure out how it worked, but he said that he was, prepared to stay and defend his country, that he couldn't leave the city at that point if he had tried, is what he told me. And that's really sort of the sentiment that I'm hearing from other people here in the Capitol. We are hearing from U.S. officials that they do believe Russian forces are closing in on Kyiv. So people here, again, still bracing for the worst, Josh.
We heard from a number of our viewers in terms of their feelings about what's happening on the ground in Kyiv. Steve tweeted, "What's resonating right now is being summed up by Mr. Sorokin, the political editor of the Kyiv Independent." He was watching at the time on MSNBC. "The hopes and dreams of many young people in Ukraine are over," according to him. Heartbreaking. Aaron, what's your sense of how Ukrainians in Kyiv feel about the future? Are they hopeful at all that Ukraine and its government and its people may prevail in all of this, or do they think it's just kind of a matter of time before Vladimir Putin takes over?
I think people here are determined. Ukrainians are known for their resolve. Think back, Joshua, eight years ago to the Maidan protests where thousands took to the streets to overthrow the Russian-backed government. They were being shot at with sniper fire, holding wooden shields to shield them, and they persisted. And it's with that spirit that I sense here in the capital. People are adamant that they're going to continue to fight for their country, to fight for their democracy and their freedom. You know, a few weeks ago, I was outside the Capitol at a sort of training camp that was privately organized. Hundreds of people gathered to learn how to shoot a gun, to learn how to evacuate the wounded, to learn how to administer first aid. And it was there that I met this 17-year-old kid. He was there to learn, participate in the training, and he told me that he was going to fight for his freedom at all costs. He said that he knew what was at stake here. He knew that the Russians had surrounded his country, and that he knew how valuable the freedoms of freedom and democracy are, and he was going to do, he said, whatever it takes. And it's a sentiment that I've heard echoed over and over and over again the time that I've been in this country, Joshua.
Before I have to let you go, Aaron, are there any other signs of Russian attacks in Kyiv in terms of cyber attacks or disruption to communications or power? We know that there have been cyber attacks this week already, including on a number of government websites and Ukrainian banks. Have we seen any more of that so far, or has it mostly been the conventional military campaign right now?
Well, there have still been ongoing cyber attacks here in Ukraine, but frankly, not at the level of what had been expected, warned by Western officials. It was thought that this military assault would be preceded by, say, the power being cut, the internet going down, the cell phones going down. Even one warning had satellite phones were going to go down. But as you can see, I'm talking to you right now. I'm still getting my emails. I'm still getting phone calls. That has not happened. I wouldn't speculate as to why that has not happened. But, you know, I've heard some U.S. military officials say that perhaps they don't want to anger the population too much. So far, the targets have been primarily military installations, and there's this thinking that perhaps President Putin feels that the people of Ukraine would welcome this kind of military activity, that perhaps that they feel that they are being kept captive in some way. One of the more delusional theories that you hear with respect to the Kremlin. But again, we simply do not know. All we do know is that the bombs fell starting in the early hours of yesterday morning, and we expect more to follow. Joshua.
Thank you, Aaron. That's NBC's Aaron McLaughlin reporting live for us from Kyiv. And since Aaron was talking about the view from the Kremlin, that's a good place for us to continue. Let's head now to Moscow and NBC's Matt Bodner. Matt, what is the latest word from the Kremlin and from Vladimir Putin?
Thank you, Josh. Well, we saw Vladimir Putin show up later this I guess yesterday evening now in the Kremlin. He actually summoned the leaders of Russia's business community. You could perhaps say that these are the modern oligarchs here in Russia. And he told them, he essentially warned them that sanctions were coming. And he kind of explained to them that he really had no choice. He had to do this move. He had to launch this large-scale military operation against Ukraine. And I want to note the wording here before I move on here. He's not calling it a war. It is a special military operation. So he explained to the business community that it had to be done. He had no other choice because there was no other way to ensure Russia's national security interests on the world stage after basically several months of playing a very high-stakes game of brinksmanship with the West. We've spent a lot of time on our networks talking about those Russian security demands, those ones from back in December where Russia demanded essentially that NATO dismantle its eastern flank, guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO, for example. So he was basically saying, sorry, you're going to get hit with sanctions, but I had no choice.
How are Russians responding to this? I mean, we've already seen protests across Russia, particularly in St. Petersburg. We've heard of hundreds of people who've gotten arrested. Is that the mainstream of what Russians are expressing? Is that more on the fringe? What's the response been like from the street?
This is definitely, I think, the most interesting kind of factor that's emerged, at least here on the Moscow end of things. I think, the really striking thing was how this all played out today. So Vladimir Putin announced the beginning of this operation, declared war on Russian state television this morning yesterday morning, at 5:45 in the morning, while the city was sleeping. Of course, Russia has a lot of time zones, so there was plenty of the country still awake already. But in Moscow, people woke up to the news that their country had invaded a nation that they consider to be a brotherly nation. And I have to say, this very dark sense of bewilderment very quickly set in. And I kind of spent the morning working my social networks, my extended social networks, kind of talking to people wherever I could to try to get a sense of, does anyone want this? And I have not found a single person. And I'm not saying they don't exist. Obviously, there is a certain demographic in Russia that will want to see this, that is supportive of this thing, this kind of action in Ukraine. But I think people are in shock. And part of the reason for that is that Russians generally didn't know too much about the Russian military buildup that we had been reporting on, that the West had been warning about for months, really. It wasn't getting a lot of coverage in the Russian state media, and kind of what they were being told about it was Russia's military was conducting military exercises on its own territory, and everything you're hearing about a buildup, a threat to Ukraine, this is some kind of hysterical Western fantasy meant to kind of undermine Russia's image internationally. So I think when we saw Vladimir Putin earlier this week on Monday start to build his case to the public for war, he gave this very, very aggressive, I'd say offensive speech to the Ukrainians Monday evening, where he basically just dismantled the idea of Ukrainian independence, of Ukrainian statehood. Only then did it really start sinking in that something might be going on. But this morning, I think a lot of people here for the very first time were confronted with the reality that there was a buildup, that Russia had been preparing this for months. And so there's this sense of shame, I feel like, in a lot of the people I'm talking to. This, of course, motivated street protests in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, actually in 53 cities across the country last night. And they arrested 1,700 people. That is a pretty sizable number. Usually you can kind of gauge the scale of a Russian protest based on how many people are detained. It's not kind of a hard and fast rule, but let's compare it to arrest numbers of previous demonstrations, typically in the past, around the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. That's pretty comparable to the numbers we'd see in an Alexei Navalny protest before he was arrested last year.
So Russians woke up today to realize that basically they had been lied to by Vladimir Putin, that he had claimed one thing about what the Russian military was going to be doing, and then saw that something entirely different was going on. In our last few seconds, Matt, very briefly, any response from the Kremlin or Putin to the new sanctions that have been imposed?
We've seen, not directly from Putin, of course, he did tell his business leaders this was coming, but we have seen some efforts from other government ministries, like the government is promising banks that have been sanctioned that they're going to receive support. Russia has a large kind of slush fund, a war chest of foreign currency reserves to kind of help back the ruble and kind of do some damage mitigation, but they're going to start burning those reserves now, so we're going to see how effective that is. But they were ready for this. We're going to start seeing their plan to mitigate it.
We'll talk more about those reserves and the sanctions in just a minute. But for now, Matt, thank you very much. That's NBC's Matt Bodner reporting for us tonight from Moscow. This story is developing fast as we take another live look at Kyiv. And now, I think, is a good time to review how quickly all of this unfolded while we have a minute to catch our breath. Now, last night, as Matt mentioned, around 10 p.m. Eastern time, Vladimir Putin went on Russian state television. He said that Russia would conduct what he called special military operations in Ukraine. Again, as Matt said, he did not call it war. Mr. Putin went on to say that countries who interfere will face, quote, consequences you have never seen, unquote. About 15 minutes after that, NBC News reporters started hearing explosions in Ukraine's capital of Kyiv. The attack started while an emergency UN Security Council meeting was underway here in New York. Ukraine requested that meeting. At one point, the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN directly asked his Russian counterpart to confirm that Russia was not attacking Ukraine, and of course he could not. Ukraine's ambassador also got the last word, literally, before the meeting adjourned.
Call Putin, call Lavrov to stop aggression. And I welcome the decision of some members of this council to meet as soon as possible to consider the necessary decision that would condemn the aggression that you launch on my people. There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
Around 10:30 Eastern Time, President Biden condemned the attack, calling it, in his words, unprovoked and unjustified. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky declared martial law. Shortly afterward, air raid sirens went off in Kyiv. NBC's Aaron McLaughlin, who we just heard from, was live on air when the sirens went off.
And there
we go.
I've just heard the first siren has just gone off. And I've been told by city officials that that indicates that this is a city under attack. That, again, is the first time we have heard sirens in the capital, Kyiv.
That is what we heard last night, and that is what got us to this point. And now we may well be headed for the second phase of this attack. So what happens next? Let's continue now with Congressman John Garamendi, a Democrat from Northern California. He's on the Armed Services Committee, and recently he returned from a trip to Brussels, where he was helping build a NATO alliance against Russia. Congressman Garamendi, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Good to be with you.
There was an unclassified congressional briefing today. Oh, go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
No, I've just said how tragic. I'm just following your timeline. How tragic that here we are with all of the issues that this world faces, and then Putin is doing this to Ukraine. I would think that the world should just, I don't know how we could possibly express such anger and dismay, but we have to do it. So you were about to ask me a question about the unclassified hearing that we just had?
Yes, sir, it was indeed. And just to the point that you made in terms of how the world expresses its response to this, I wonder if you heard anything in that briefing that would speak to that, to what the response might be, or anything that you learned that might help light the way toward a response.
I think we've learned about the response in three different ways today. First of all, the immediate reaction to the Russians when they found out what the Russian government was doing to Ukraine. We're going to see a lot more street action in Russia over the period ahead, because the second piece of it, the sanctions. Those sanctions are going to really be crippling to the Russian economy, and certainly to all those big fat businessmen that showed up in Putin's office earlier today that were told not to worry. But they're going to have to worry, because the sanctions go directly at them in their businesses, but even more so to them personally and their families. So the streets of Russia are going to be filled repeatedly over time, and that is the principal jeopardy that Putin has. Similarly, the third thing is that that we've learned, and it's obvious to, I think, everybody, that Russia has a superior military position over the Ukrainian military that is likely to result in the capture of Kyiv and other principal cities. But the Russian bear had best be very, very careful, because he's about to take a big bite out of a porcupine. And that always results in a very unhappy bear when that happens. But that's exactly what Putin has done. He is going to capture a porcupine that will not give up. We're very, very familiar, Americans who have traveled as my wife and I and others have, to Ukraine, that this is a vibrant economy that loves its freedom, that made a decision in 1991 not to be part of Russia and is not going to stand idly by in their homes. They'll be out on the streets eventually protesting, as they did 7 years ago when Russia was dominating the government. That government fell, and here we are today.
Let me ask you about the second thing you mentioned in terms of the sanctions. We got a lot of questions and comments about sanctions today from our audience. One of our viewers tweeted, "We need a bit more aggressive and direct sanctions on Russia. We're still playing into Putin's playbook. He calculated all this, and we are underestimating this modern-day dictator." Congressman, there were a lot of questions during today's presidential press conference as to why the administration didn't go farther, why they're allowing these sanctions to take effect before assessing them further. What's your read on how powerful these sanctions will be in terms of stopping Vladimir Putin, or whether, you know, the Western nations are going to have to do more anyway?
Well, it's highly unlikely that the sanctions are going to stop the invasion. The invasion's underway, and it'll run its course. Will it successfully capture Kyiv? Probably. Will it capture other towns? Probably. Will it be able to capture a country? No. Ukraine is a large country, about the size of Texas. It also has 40 million people, all of whom love their democracy and do not want to be a puppet state for Russia. The result of that is that this is a longer-term issue with regard to the ultimate disposition of what will happen in Ukraine. Now, the sanctions are designed to put immediate and long-term pressure on Russia and on Putin's oligarch friends. Those will take a while to play out. The freezing of assets, that has taken place. The freezing of bank accounts of the Russian banks, that has taken place. What effect will that have on the Russian economy? It will be an effect that will take place in the days and weeks ahead. But each week that goes by, those sanctions will have a further impact on the Russian economy, and those men and women that were in the streets of Russia yesterday morning will be back, and this time, I believe, with a vengeance, because their own personal situation has been significantly impacted by what Putin is doing to Ukraine. So the sanctions are designed to take place over a longer period of time.
Congressman, briefly, before I have to let you go, I have to ask you about NATO. You met with a number of NATO officials. I know that President Zelensky has been kind of musing as to why more nations haven't helped. He gave a speech tonight saying that NATO is afraid. He asked everyone to take them to NATO, and they didn't. What is your sense of NATO's response to this based on your most recent conversations with them before we go?
NATO is unified. Keep in mind that Trump spent 4 years trying to destroy NATO, to create discord, and he succeeded in doing that. Just 6 months ago, when we met with NATO parliamentarians from all 30 countries, they were going every which way. Now that this attack is underway and the buildup to it, NATO came together, 100% together, 100% determined to put in place all the deterrents necessary to keep Russia from doing anything further in Western Europe. The European Union has also unified. They couldn't even agree on milk prices, but they surely now have agreed on how to push back against Russia. So we have a situation here where there is a unification, a solidarity among NATO and the European Union and the United States, and also Japan and other Pacific countries, to stand in solidarity, to do what is ever necessary to make the sanctions really hurt Russia. All of that's in place. So the conference that I attended, a bipartisan delegation, was very, very excited, very pleased to see the solidarity that was now in place.
Congressman John Garamendi, a Democrat from Northern California. Congressman, good to hear from you tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Joshua.
Coming up, many Ukrainians are contemplating a big question: stay or go? We'll get a view of what life is like right now in Kyiv. Also, we would welcome your questions about this crisis. We've already answered a few of them. And we love your stories about how all of this is affecting you or your loved ones. Follow us at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also give us a call, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Wherever you are around the world, we're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Let's get another view from Ukraine with the people who are enduring this invasion. It's a nation of about 43 million people living through some terrifying times. Many of them woke up to the aftermath of overnight attacks before hearing more missiles and explosions. 'To our knowledge, Ukraine has seen more than a dozen confirmed attacks, including in big cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv, as you can see here on our map. President Zelensky said 137 soldiers were killed today. Over 300 were injured. Those numbers are updated just as of a few minutes before we came on the air. Many people around the country have either lost their homes or are abandoning them. Huge traffic jams are slowing them down from entering Poland to the west or escaping to other Ukrainian cities. But not everyone is leaving. Quite a few are trying to keep their cities up and running and taking shelter and staying put. Some folks took refuge in the subway stations. Many are also stocking up on food. Long lines and confusion have been common at some grocery stores, and having cash on hand could become vital very soon. ATMs had long lines of people waiting to withdraw money. Joining us now from Kyiv is Terrell Jermaine Starr, Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Eurasia Center with the Atlantic Council and the host of the podcast Black Diplomats. Mr. Starr, welcome back to the program. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
You shared a video on Twitter of people waiting in a long line for gas. Let's take a quick look at that first.
This is a long line. Starts here, the queue going for gas. The queue for gas.
How are folks doing where you are right now?
We're alive. I know that sounds fatalistic, but that's just the reality of our situation right now. This country has undergone massive airstrikes. The fact that civilian areas where I live, quite frankly, that haven't been hit is a bit of a miracle. It's very stressful here. I know my Ukrainian colleagues who are journalists are extremely stressed out. We don't know where it is to be safe. We feel very blessed, very fortunate. We survived this barrage today. Tomorrow could be a completely different story. People are very exhausted. But there's not chaos here. I have to say that. And given these circumstances, you would think that there would be chaos here, but it hasn't been. It's relatively quiet despite all the things that are happening. So we are in, even though people are nervous, they're anxious, a little bit, very much afraid. There's not chaos here, and there's a resiliency in this country that is very commendable.
What's gone into folks' decisions about whether to stay or whether to go? I guess other than people like yourself who are working as journalists or who've kind of decided to stay to bear witness to what's happening, for everyday people, how are they deciding whether to stay or to go?
It depends. One, do you have the resources to go? I mean, you know, being able to leave the country, making sure that you have the proper documents to go, going someplace and being able to pay for housing. Everybody doesn't have the luxury of doing that. I know there are some people, I'm staying with a friend right now. He sent his kids out of the country and he's staying here because he feels like he needs to defend his country. It's very terrifying to me. It's very scary to me. I have friends who are saying that they are going into the Ukrainian military to fight. And that means that you have to face down the Russian military and face down death. I mean, I literally have friends who are going to risk their lives against, to fight a war that's senseless and doesn't make sense. And it's very hard for me to even articulate this to you, but this is what war is. I have friends who are very much impacted by this. That plays a role into why they're staying. Another reason is, again, it's the resilience. People don't feel like they should be forced out of their home. Like I told you in previous previous shows, people died to defend their democracy here, and they don't want to feel like they're just being pushed out of their land because Putin wants to be a bully.
We asked our followers online what's resonating the most with them about what's happening in Ukraine. Justin wrote, "I've been thinking a lot about my uncle, a Ukrainian immigrant who escaped the USSR's horrors. His national pride was always strong, but never more evident than when Ukraine declared its independence. His heart would be breaking today." Terrell, I imagine that that's part of what's underpinning some of this, is that Ukraine has a long history of dealing with Soviet power, from the end of World War I, through Lenin, through Stalin, the Holodomor, which was a mass famine that killed millions of people. It seems like the roots of this resilience and this determination run extremely deep. And I'm guessing that's what is part of what makes this so scary, is because the country kind of has a history of pushing back against this kind of aggression.
Yes, and it goes deeper than what you said. You brought up a lot of great historical points. It goes back to the Tsarist period, right? You know, we can't forget about that. It goes back to Catherine the Great. It goes back to this country having their land taken away from them even during the 1700s. And so, you know, one of the things I want to touch on is back, you know, with the USSR in 1991. The Russian government and the Duma, they never wanted to recognize Ukraine as an independent nation. So what we're seeing right now is more than 30 years in the making. I did an episode on my podcast, Black Diplomats, where I featured 2 Ukrainians, including one military journalist that's out in the field right now with the Ukrainian military, where they all talked about the 30-year anniversary or celebration of the fall of the Soviet Union, where they said basically that they're still fighting for their independence to this day because Putin refuses to recognize not only Ukraine as a sovereign nation, but Ukrainians that are independent of, you know, and having their own agency, when he was recognizing the Donbass and Luhansk regions. In his language, I mean, the way that he talked about Ukrainians is the way that racist white people talk about Black people in the United States. He actually, and when he says that we're coming to Ukraine to denazify these people, it's basically a dog whistle, and basically, you know, it's the equivalent of calling Black people the N-word. I know that sounds like a stretch, but it isn't. Ukraine is Putin's Chicago. You know how people want to stereotype Chicago when they talk about crime, when they talk about, you know, bad activity that are happening in the cities, and it needs to be shut down and it needs to be over-policed. It's the same narrative that Putin is making about Ukraine. Lies, lack of context, a lack of history, a lack of acknowledging of structural discrimination, and Ukraine is a victim of this revisionism, of these lies. And so so Ukraine technically has been independent, but as far as Russia is concerned, it never should have been, and that has been the attitude of the Kremlin, which predates Putin.
I know we're running a little bit over, but I have to ask one more quick thing. I don't mean to make this too personal, but you said you had friends who have gone off to fight to try to defend Ukraine. Have they and have you made peace with the possibility that they won't make it back?
Yeah. I thank you for asking me that, because I want people to really appreciate how much this is not a game. Yeah, it terrifies me. It scares me, and I was afraid for myself, and I was afraid for my friends. I was ashamed to say it at first because this is my first time covering a war. I'm not ashamed of it anymore. I mean, I'm become more resilient, but yeah, it terrifies me, and it just really shows. The bottom line is that this is a senseless war, and Putin has attacked this country for absolutely nothing. My friends are signing up to fight and are risking their lives for nothing. That's what people need to know. This war is unwarranted. It never should have happened. Putin had no intention of negotiating a good faith. And I have friends who are out there who are risking their lives, and it's all for nothing, absolutely nothing.
Terrell Jermaine Starr, I'm sorry to pull the scab off a wound for you, but I really appreciate you being willing to talk about this and being honest about that. And I thank you for making time for us, sir. Thank you very much.
Anytime, I'll always be here.
Coming up, Russia's invasion shook up the world's stock markets, but oil prices soared. We'll explore what this attack could mean for the global economy, including what you pay at the gas pump. That's just ahead. Stay close. Before we get back to the situation in Ukraine, we have an update from Minneapolis. More of the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. Today, a federal jury found 3 former police officers guilty on all charges of violating Mr. Floyd's civil rights. Thomas Lane, J. Alexander King, and Tu Tao were convicted of depriving him of his constitutional rights while acting under government authority, or in legal terms, under color of law. Tao and Lane were also convicted for not trying to stop former officer Derek Chauvin from using excessive force. All 3 of them face up to life in prison, but a punishment that severe seems unlikely. They will face another trial in June on state charges of aiding and abetting murder and manslaughter. Let's refocus on Russia now. Today, President Biden announced that the U.S. government is imposing more sanctions in response to the invasion of Ukraine.
We've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets. We've cut off Russia's largest bank, a bank that holds more than 1/3 of Russia's banking assets by itself, cut it off from the U.S. financial system. And today, we're also blocking 4 more major banks. That means every asset they have in America will be frozen. Some of the most powerful impacts of our actions will come over time, as we squeeze Russia's access to finances and technology for strategic sectors of its economy and degrade its industrial capacity for years to come.
Now, this is the second set of sanctions the president has announced this week. Today on currency exchanges, Russia's ruble fell to its weakest level against the dollar ever. The Russian stock market also fell sharply. Here in the U.S., all 3 major stock indices started the day down significantly, but the Dow, the NASDAQ, and the S&P 500 all ended the day in positive territory. Let's get into the economics of all this with NBC News Now anchor Allison Morris. And Allison, let's just start with what happened in the markets today. They tend to kind of freak out, seize up when something like this happens and then level off. Is that what we expect to happen now?
Well, let me tell you what happened today. Nobody expected, right? This morning, the markets were down 850 points. The Dow, that is, before it bounced back. No one thought it was going to come back that strongly, but it proved a point that a lot of us who follow the markets and who follow investing try to tell people. On a day like today, you do not sell, right? All selling does is lock in your losses. People panic. They think, ooh, I need to get out of the markets. Well, if you called your trader this morning and said, I want to pull out my investments, I want to shut down my 401k, I want to close up shop here on my portfolio, you would have missed the market swinging back up. I mean, look at the Dow. At one point it was, the NASDAQ. At one point it was down more than 3%. It closed up 3%. And what that tells us is the markets are just all over the place right now. No one really knows what Vladimir Putin is going to do. He is unpredictable at best. And so expect to see some more of this back and forth, some shakiness in the days to come.
During the press conference with the president today, NBC's Peter Alexander asked the president about one of the world's financial systems that I don't think's gotten a whole lot of attention, because why would you know about it unless you work in banking? But here is the question, and then I'll ask you about it on the other side. Watch.
Given the full-scale invasion, given that you're not pursuing disconnecting Russia from what's called SWIFT, the international banking system, or other sanctions at your disposal, respectfully, sir, what more are you waiting for?
Specifically, with the sanctions we've imposed exceed SWIFT. The sanctions we imposed exceed anything that's ever been done. The sanctions we imposed have generated 2/3 of the world joining us. They are profound sanctions. Let's have a conversation in another month or so to see if they're working.
Now, there was a call today with members of Congress that we mentioned, and Congresswoman Young Kim, who is a Republican from Southern California, pressed Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on why the Biden administration was not blocking Russia from SWIFT, and Secretary Yellen repeated the point that these sanctions have more consequences, but everything's on the table. What is SWIFT and why does it matter here?
So most people probably never heard of it before today, right? And if you had a shot or took a shot every single time we said SWIFT on air today, our viewers would be under the table drunk by tonight, right?
Exactly.
We talked about it a lot. So basically think of it this way. SWIFT is a messaging system. Think of it as like a WhatsApp that works with international financial transactions. It doesn't actually make the transactions, but if I'm sitting here in New York, for example, and my money's at Bank of America, and Joshua, you live in Paris, and you keep all of your assets at BNP Paribas, a French bank, and I want to send some money over to you, the SWIFT system is going to send the message from bank to bank that gets that money moving. This is an international system. Russia's on it. We are on it. And so the thought is here, let's boot them off so they can't very easily make international financial transactions. We've seen this before. It's happened to Iran. Now, why President Biden can't just go like this and say, all right, let's boot Russia off, is because we don't run it. There are central banks involved, so the Federal Reserve is involved here, Bank of Japan, European Central Bank, the Treasury of Belgium is involved here because SWIFT is based just outside of Brussels. So this has to be a group decision, and Europe is really concerned about this right now. We've been talking about this all day long. They have the most exposure here economically to Russia, and they are worried that if you kick Russia off, it could be really rough on Europe.
One last thing I got to ask you about, which has to do with energy prices here in the U.S. The president said that the administration would do what it could to prevent them from rising too much. What is the impact that Americans might expect to see, and does the administration really have much power to prevent big price increases?
Not entirely. So, look, I think everyone has just come to accept that prices at the pump are probably going back up again. If you haven't seen it when you go to fill up already, they should be going up. Oil prices today over $100. You generally tend to see the effects of that in the weeks to come. So what we're probably going to see is the national average gas price getting closer to $4. People in California watching might think, what are you talking about? I'm already paying that. But the national average should get closer to that. And then expect a trickle-down effect from what's going on in Russia and Ukraine to affect everything from, home heating oil, all kinds of energy and fuel prices. Just expect all of that to be a little more expensive. We're not going to get any more relief there, probably not in the short term at least.
NBC News Now anchor Allison Morris. Remember, you can join her here weekdays from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern. That's 8 to 10 p.m. GMT. Allison, good to see you. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Joshua.
When we come back, we'll focus on the instigator of this invasion. Thousands gathered across Russia for anti-war protests today. Why they took this risk, how the Kremlin is responding, and what Vladimir Putin's strategy might be.
Нет, Вай, нет! Нет, Вай, нет!
We spent most of tonight focused on Ukraine. Let's shift gears to Russia, where the government is cracking down on anti-war protests. Today, crowds gathered in dozens of Russian cities, as you can see, rallying against the invasion. According to one monitoring group, at least 1,700 people have been arrested. Many protesters are calling for a peaceful resolution.
Потому что мы считаем, что все конфликты должны решаться мирным путем, без применения насилия в чью-либо сторону. Господи, как это называется? Указ, не указ, что там он распоряжение отдал о своих этих, о начале военных.
Now, these protests are clearly resonating with quite a few of you as well. Here's some of what you told us. Ducky writes, for the first time, I can truly see daylight between Putin and the Russian citizens. There is hope. Robin tweeted, the Russian protesters are risking their lives to side with Ukraine and denounce Putin's attacks. And Lisa writes, I'm hoping it's enough to finally get the Russian people to turn against Putin. Meanwhile, the Kremlin says there is a solution to end the attack. Surrender. Apparently, Vladimir Putin wants two things. His press secretary laid them out today for the state-owned news outlet RT. A guarantee of neutral status, meaning no joining NATO, and no weapons on Ukrainian territory. Then Russia would supposedly be willing to negotiate terms. Russia's former deputy foreign minister told NBC's Keir Simmons Vladimir Putin will not stop until these terms are met.
I'm sure that he believes that he will get what he wants.
And if he doesn't?
If he doesn't, he already mentioned that if he doesn't, he will find the way to strike back.
Let's break all this down with NBC News analyst Jonathan Alter. He spent almost 30 years as a senior editor and columnist at Newsweek. Mr. Alter, welcome. Good to see you again.
Hi, Joshua.
Based on your experience in Russia and watching Russia as it's kind of evolved over the years, especially post-Cold War Russia, what do you make of what's happening right now and the way Vladimir Putin is playing this?
Well, it's brutal and it's tragic, but he's not really holding very many cards, and I think he's miscalculated in a monumental, historic way in what he's done. Normally, at the beginning of a war, you have a rally around the flag quality. In any country that goes to war, people assume that the government must have some reason to do so. We saw something quite different today in Moscow and around the country. 54 different Russian cities had protests. You had Alexei Navalny, who's the main opposition leader, who's in prison. He stood up in court and denounced the war. And so even though the Putin regime is threatening people with essentially life sentences, they've said that if you participate in demonstrations, it will be on your record, quote, for life. Nonetheless, thousands and thousands of people are demonstrating. And when the Russian boys start coming home in body bags, it's going to get worse. So this is not going to get better for Vladimir Putin as time goes on. And he also got a lot more than he bargained for from the Ukrainians, who, even if their government is toppled and a puppet is imposed on them, they will continue with an insurgency and with a resistance that will be an enormous problem for Vladimir Putin.
NBC's Keir Simmons interviewed Mr. Putin back in June, and he described the United States as the original aggressor in the region. I'd like to play this for you first, and then I'll ask you about it on the other side. Watch.
You had crossed an ocean, brought thousands of personnel and thousands of units of military equipment close to our borders, and yet you believe that we're acting aggressively, and somehow you're not. Just look at that. Pot calling the kettle black.
So how much of this is about Washington and Moscow rather than just Ukraine? Is this about Ukraine, or is this about something bigger, a bigger message he wants to send?
Well, I think it's about Putin trying to reassemble the old Soviet Union. Remember, he was a KGB agent, and he was tremendously embarrassed, as he told former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright when they first met 22 years ago, when he was first coming into power. He was, quote, embarrassed by the breakup of the Soviet Union. So, and then he was further embarrassed in the Maidan Revolution of 2014 and 15 in Ukraine, where his puppet was thrown out and had to go with his tail between his legs to Moscow. And we had a democratically elected, Western-looking government in Ukraine right on his border. So what he's really concerned about here is that he doesn't have a puppet as a buffer between him and Western Europe. And that's what he wants. And so he's trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And it's going to be very expensive for him across the board, not to mention the fact that thousands and thousands of people will lose their lives, and that will be on his account. And he will have a hard time living that down.
With regard to that expense, I did want to ask you about the military strategy. We just got a tweet from the UK's defense ministry in which it noted that, among other things, the Ukrainian armed forces have reportedly halted Russia's advance toward Chernobyl, and fighting probably continues on the outskirts of the city. Don't have a Ukrainian map handy, but basically the Dnieper River runs through Ukraine. Chernobyl's up at the top in the north. Kyiv's a little bit south of it. On the other side of the river is Chernobyl. So apparently that front for Russian forces has not quite opened up yet. They've taken Chernobyl, which already gives them like a north-south path into Kyiv. But this is another approach that apparently, according to the UK's defense ministry, has not been breached yet. Before I have to let you go, with regard to the military push into Ukraine, how far do you think Vladimir Putin would be willing to go in order to take this country?
Oh, I think he'll go all the way to Kyiv, and he probably will be successful. His forces are overwhelmingly powerful.
I'm sorry, Jonathan, I beg your pardon. I didn't ask the question properly. I don't mean geographically how far. I mean, to what lengths do you think he would go? Is there anything he would not do, for example, to secure a victory in Kyiv? That's more what I'm getting at before we go.
Well, not a lot that he wouldn't do. You know, he's been brandishing nuclear weapons in recent days. So he's kind of all in on this. He doesn't have an easy way to retreat, and he's going to need, after he does take the capital, which they will do eventually, he's going to have to settle in, responding to a guerrilla war, an insurgency. And remember, in Afghanistan, where they intervened militarily in 1980, Leonid Brezhnev, the premier of the Soviet Union at the time, thought it would last 3 weeks. They were there 9 years. And when they were finally driven out, that was the end of the Soviet empire. It was their Vietnam. And this time they got a Vietnam right on their doorstep. Moscow's got a big problem here, despite what will be some early military victories.
Jonathan Alter, appreciate you making time for us tonight, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joshua.
This morning, the city of Kharkiv, Ukraine, woke up to the sound of explosions. People have been in long lines getting food and gas while they can. Some are holding prayer books as they prepare for what's next. Before we go tonight, from our partners at Sky News, correspondent John Sparks has the story from Kharkiv.
The people of Kharkiv now live a new reality. Their city under siege by an enemy unseen. And the front line isn't far. The Russian military sits on its northern outskirts. They awoke with a shock in the center of this city. Vladimir Putin's operation is real, not imagined. How are you feeling this morning?
Тревожно. Все знают такие новости, и, в принципе, как и все эти люди, ожидают плохих новостей.
They don't usually queue for the local supermarket, but today was anything but normal. Elena took her prayer book on the morning shop.
Я прошу Бога нам помочь, сохранить нам жизнь, сохранить нашу страну, наш город.
In Kharkiv, the competition for petrol and diesel is fierce, for many are trying to leave the city. Alexandra and her partner began to pack after the first artillery shells hit the city.
We woke up at 5 o'clock from these hits, yeah?
Yeah.
And we were very stressed and worried, so we didn't have enough time to take these clothes or something like that, just the most important things.
Yeah.
Even I don't know if I took everything important, or but may God help me and may God help all of us. Yeah. This is the only one thing what I can say.
There are queues everywhere for shops, supermarkets, pharmacies, and the occasional thud of artillery here in the city's northern suburbs. Incoming shells, and they're not far away. The Ukrainian army has taken up positions on the city's outskirts, but their personnel are badly outnumbered. The Russian military crossed the frontier through multiple checkpoints and shelled this residential neighborhood in a place called Chuhuyev. The fire service said a boy was killed in the attack. This country knows the price it is likely to pay, and the people of Kharkiv are getting prepared. The largest line we witnessed was formed by those who wanted to give blood.
Я не маю бойового досвіду, я не можу захищати країну зі зброєю в руках, і все, що я можу зробити для того, щоб тут, в принципі, був мир, хоч скільки можна, щоб втримались наші бійці, які там ось поруч захищають зараз.
The blood clinic's manager, Yuri Vahavenko, took us for a tour. He said he hadn't seen it this busy since the beginning of the conflict with Russia in 2014. I'm just doing my job, he said. The heroes here are those who give blood. At the central train station, life-changing decisions are made in an instant. City residents, Alina and Yuri, will seek shelter in neighboring Poland, and they worry they'll never return.
Верить в себя и сражаться. Я надеюсь, что наша армия сможет достойно это пройти.
John Sparks, Sky News in Kharkiv, eastern Ukraine.
Hey, thank you for making time for us tonight. So much to talk about with this story, and we'll continue to cover this in the days to come. Obviously, there's that UN Security Council meeting that is tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. GMT, and we still want to hear your thoughts and your questions about the situation in Ukraine. We're at NBC Now tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. Feel free to leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC, or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Do stay with NBC News Now for the latest on this fast-moving story. We are back tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. GMT. But until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.